Each component in React has a life cycle which can be monitored and manipulated during its three main phases. And the three phases are mounting, updating, and unmounting. So the mounting method is called as soon as a component is loaded first time. And then whenever we make any updates to the component, updating method is called. And then if we remove the component from the page, the unmounting component is called. All right. So let's take a look at the app I have on my screen. So I have a very small app which has an index.js, which is calling the component app, and in app.js I have pretty much nothing. So if I go and see the output, I have a blank page because I have not given any code over here. Okay. So to understand the life cycle of a component, let's go ahead and create a component right away. Before that, let me tell you that a component can be created either by using the class uh, methods or functional methods. That means we can create a component by using class or by using function. Okay. So first, what we will do is we will see the various life cycle of a component through class methods. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a component called counter. Okay, create a component called counter, and if you give RCC tab in Visual Studio, we're going to get a class component, the template, right away. So we don't have to code all those things. So we get this by default, and div tag will have the same file name that we had given. All right. Um, so let's go ahead and render. Okay. So now this is only returning counter. So let's go ahead and create a constructor. Okay. So here, since we are using this class model, we'll have some methods specific to class like constructor. Um, those who don't know about OOPS concept, constructor is a method that gets called as soon as an instance of a class is created. So in this screen, let's say I create a constructor. And since I'm calling a constructor, I have to give a super method. Then creating a state variable here, count. Okay, so count is the variable I'm going to create. That means as soon as we this component is loaded, this constructor method will be called, and a state variable count will be created with a default value of 0. Okay, and let me log this particular event so that when we run the program, we'll get an idea when this constructor is getting called. Okay, so I'm just logging it saying constructor is been called. Okay. Now, so already there is a render method. So by default, whenever we create a component using class, we'll have a render method by default. In addition to that, we are having a constructor method as well that we had just created. Okay. Now, it comes, as I said, component has a life cycle. So, um, the First stage is constructor, and then it will call in another method called component did mount. Okay? Um, component did mount. So this is the function, the method that will be called as soon as the component is loaded. Okay. So I'm not doing anything here. I'm just trying to uh, give a console log message that component did mount is called. So this function is called, it will log this particular message. Okay. And whenever we unmount the component, it is going to call another method called component will unmount. Okay. Here also I'm just trying to give a log saying component will unmount is called. Okay. So these are the events. Okay. So we have a constructor method which will log constructor has been called, and then we have a component did mount method which will log that component did mount is called, and similarly component will unmount is there which will be called as soon as the component is removed from the document object model. Okay. And here in render, let me have a counter method. So let me give a div tag. Then I'm going to give an h1 counter. This dot state. So remember we created the state variable count. I'm just trying to print that over here. Okay. So the count, a counter will be displayed, and then the value of the count variable is going to get displayed over there. I'm going to create a button, and then an arrow function over here. This is basically will call another function called increment, with basic because we want to increment the counter, right? So I'm calling a function called uh, increment, and closing the button tag over here. So actually I should give here button on click, because we have to call this when we on click command. So as soon as you click on this button, it is going to call this increment function. All right. So let's go ahead and create this increment function as well. Okay. Uh, let's create here an increment function. And this increment function is going to increment the value of this count. Okay. So how to update that state count is we have to call the set state method. This dot set state, and then incrementing the counter. So counter is a is a key value there. So counter colon, and now we increment the counter. This dot state dot count plus one. So whatever is the value of the count variable is going to increment by one, This is happening inside the increment function, which we are calling the click of this button. Okay, and to give a name for that, let's say I give a name here, say click name for the button. Now component is ready. So let's take a look again. So this component has the component name is counter, and it has a method name constructor, increment, component did mount, component will unmount, and render. So these are the methods this class has. And the reason why we have written all these methods are some of these methods are part of the life cycle of the method, and we have given console.log, so we will know when which method is getting called. Okay. Now let's go to our app.js because we need to call this particular component, right? So let's go to app.js. In app.js, we let's have this whole thing as a class. So treat it as a class. This is the app.js. Now in app.js, again, let's have a constructor because we are using as a class here. So let's have a constructor, and constructor will call the super method. Now this here we are going to again create a state variable called toggle toggle true. So this state variable is I mean we are creating in the app.js, and I'll tell you why we are creating this. Okay. Uh, in this return, let's have a button. Okay, so this button is going to call, I mean enable or disable the counter component. Okay, so let's have a button here on click, and then I'm giving an arrow function. um, Now this set state that we just now created, right, that we have to update here. So we'll just see in a bit why we are updating it. So toggle is the state we created, and we have given the default value as true. So what we will do, whenever this button is clicked, the value of that toggle variable is going to be the if it is true, it is going to be false. If it is false, it's going to be true. So toggle that is not of toggle will be initially it was true, so not of toggle will be false. So when we click on the button, this is going to be false. And again when we click, that's going to be and I gave this the name for this button as show hide. Okay. Button has been created. And below I give a condition. Okay, that if the value of toggle is true, only then you display or call the component. I'm giving this dot state dot toggle question mark, that we are checking the condition. If this dot state dot toggle is true, then call counter object component. Okay. Then call counter colon else don't do anything null. Only if it is true, it is going to call the counter component, else it's not going to do anything. Okay, so that's pretty much. Let's review this. So we have an app.js where we have a button. So when you click on the button, uh, it should either display the counter object or it should hide the counter object or component. Okay, how this is happening? Because when you click on the button, the value of this toggle is going to change it. So when it is changing, let's say it became false, it comes to the line number 17. It checks if it is true or not. If it is true, then counter component is called. If it is false, it will be null. That means counter component will not be displayed. All right. So let's see how. Okay, there is an error here. Counter is not defined. So since we are calling here counter component, we have to import that. So let's import counter from counter. So we are all set. Right. Now when you see this page, so as soon as the page is loaded, you don't see anything in console log. And when you click on this show or hide button, now the component has been loaded. So the first time, since the component has been loaded the first time, you see here constructor has been called, message is occurred because the constructor was called, and then component did mount is called, right? So these are the two methods you see in counter component. The constructor was called as soon as the component was loaded. Constructor method was called, and that's why we see this message in the log. Constructor has been called, and then component did mount also called. Okay, and that's why we see this message component did mount, right? However, the component will mount is not being displayed because it will display only when we unmount the component, and as well as component did update also. Message did not appear because we did not update anything in the component. So let's do that. Okay. So if I click on this button, this component will be updated and the counter will increment, right? So I click on this. Now you see here component did update message occurred. That is because we have component did update method in the component, right? Which will invoke as soon as you make any changes to the component. But you see, next time when you click on this button, the constructor and component did mount was not called. That will be called only first time. Now, see, I keep on clicking this button. That means I'm keeping on updating the component. Or the only method that is getting invoked here is component did update. Okay. Now, if I click this show or hide button one more time, what is going to happen is based on our code that this component will be removed. Why? Because in this app.js we are having a condition, right, on click. So if I click on the button, whatever is the value of this toggle set will be reversed, right? If the value is false, it is going to be true, and if it is true, it is going to be false. So now the value is true. That is why we are able to see this component. Okay. So if I click on this button now, you see here component will unmount is called, right? So this method will be invoked only when we unmount the component or remove the component, right? So that is the life cycle of a component that we have seen today. Basically, it is basically there are three phases, right? That is when a component is uh, mounted, okay, or loaded. Second is when a component is updated, and third is when the component will unmount. These are the three main phases. Okay, constructor has been given because we gave this message in the constructor. That is why this message is appearing. All right, and otherwise, the main three phases are mount, update, and unmount. Okay, so this is how we achieve or we, understand the life cycle of a component through class. Okay, there's a different way of achieving the same thing using functions. So we'll have to use a hook called use effect to create or to understand the life cycle of a component. Okay, that we'll see in the next session. Till then, please try this method of knowing the life cycle of a component. Okay, thank you.